Now, both the parties have made their basic positions clear. Now, the next stage is the debate.
I believe my distinguished opponent, Dr. Deruva, sorry,
Jacob.
Jacob, makes it much easier. Huh? Yeah. Okay, I can refer just to Jacob. Okay.
Feel free.
I believe that the presentation by Jacob represents on a crucial binary contrast, which is different decisively from my binary contrast. His contrast is the distinction, and I'll use my own terms if you forgive me, his distinction between the Semitic religions and the Indic faiths. This is the central foundation, I believe, of his. What's the central binary contrast on which I'm based? I'm saying that the much more profound and fundamental distinction for understanding is the distinction between pre-modernity and modernity. So this is two very fundamental points. This relates to one's understanding of India, and you have three positions on India, on what India of today is. One, it is still basically a traditional society, Ashish Nandi, critical traditionality, whatever. Two, the Rudolphs, for example, between tradition and modernity. Three, my position, many others, India is already in its own kind of tradition, and you can't get away from it. And the relationship between modernity and tradition is not that modernity does away with tradition, but it does something much more fundamental. It, in fact, re-traditionalizes and de-traditionalizes tradition. And that's a very complex understanding rather than the idea here. So, given that, let me take the other related point to this. There are two ways in which you can look at this issue. How does religion or religious systems or whatever you want to call it shape or affect the world that we have? And with regard to religion, there are basically two approaches. One is a philosophical approach in which you give fundamental emphasis to the nature of the doctrines, faiths, or even to the absence of doctrines and faiths or whatever. And the other approach is a sociological approach. In other words, it's not those systems, etc., that shape, but the much more simple fundamental starting point of asking the question, why do believers believe, or whatever people believe? Why? And what is the reasons for these enormous variations, well, so etc. So mine is that, and I will simply say there that if you talk about Hinduism, again, there are three approaches. One is to say essentially a philosophical Hinduism, which has always been there based on the Vedas, etc., which has, of course, increased its influence subsequently, the process of syndicalization. The second approach, people like Fuller and others who talk about the combination of the great tradition and the little tradition, in which you will have to give a greater weight to the great tradition rather than little traditions, but look at the... And the third, which is that is simply a compendium label for a whole congeries of sects and so on, etc. But undoubtedly, the philosophical Hinduism over the period of time, especially accelerating in the last 200 years, has gained ground here. But this is important because, of course, to say that there is no philosophical dimension all is not correct. If you look at the Vedas, their attitude of the truth is itself an expression of doctrinal intolerance. Many. You have your truth and I have mine. But my truth is superior in a sense to yours because it includes yours, truths, etc. So I think we should be careful about this question of binary. Let me come to the second point. I've given central emphasis to the question of modernity. Modernity affects everything. My difference from Jacob's position is that he talks about the secular state influencing and shaping secularism. Mine is the exact opposite. Secularism comes in the latter half of the 19th century. It is decisively shaped by the Enlightenment and modernity, and in fact then provides a different kind of understanding to the question of the secular state, and a different basis for that. The same thing actually happens to the question of secularization. Secularization is not, this is also related to the question of how does modernity come about. And there are three kinds of approaches, again, you can take and combine these in different weights. Christianity, Reformation, Renaissance, capitalism. Three, how do you combine them? Protestant ethic, Weber has one view, etc. I'm very clear. There is no comparison in terms of the importance of Christianity or of the Renaissance. Renaissance more important. Capitalism is the decisive question, and how capitalism emerges in modernity, and it reshapes and transforms everything. So, capitalist modernity, secular. What does it mean? This is again related to the question of what distinguishes pre-modernity from modernity, and that is that the rate, depth, and scope of change in modernity is extraordinary. It's a rupture. as Gunnar talks about. Others, of course, say no. There's a continuity. The past continues to emphasize the present much more, etc. If you take the view here, then the point is that this enormous rate, depth, scope of change leads to a notion of progress, leads to a notion of change, leads to a notion of secularization as decline in the influence, which is undeniable. It's only an unbalanced culturalism which emphasizes, because this then connects to all sorts of things about what is society. You start off with the question of communal conflict, you're talking about the question of order. How is order connected to the term society, social order connected to the notion of society, to the notion of culture, to the notion of religion? And what are the connections between these three processes, etc.? My point here is that secularization as decline is so obvious in the economic field, in the political field, in the social field, think of nationalism, etc. The only area in which you can talk about the enduring importance is in the culture. Therefore, you'll find that everybody talks about the importance of culturalism in order to understand our societies today and so on. Let me also take the third point, the question of rights discourse. The central point about secularism is that once you center morality on the good of human beings in this life rather than the transcend, you are talking about a universal notion of rights and all it comes in. No religious system of past or present Christianity has ever had intrinsic to itself the notion of gender justice or the notion of rights discourse. It's a modern discourse. Let's accept that. And there are even differences between other pasts and so on in terms of Greek philosophy having much more to offer than Indian philosophy because of peculiar sociological characteristics we gave right to the city-state and all the rest of it. The fourth point here, and then we'll go to the last one, is that insofar, it's very tricky about communalism, but insofar we can have a kind of crude understanding of communalism as a politics of religious identity, if you like. Okay? What happens to identities in modernity? Four basic things happen to identities in modernity. So let's not talk about the similarities of the past or even the religious identity today. Four things. One, in modernity you have newer and more identities. Two, the identities become sharper and more bounded. Three, the identities become more flexible and revisable. Identities are not merely handed down, they are adopted. Four, identities in modernity compete, they clash, they repel, they overlap, they combine in all sorts of ways that make all notions of identity far more difficult to understand, much more complex than ever before. And they must recognize this and address that. Lastly, let me take the question, third point, about tolerances. What is the argument that religious pluralism or traditional, and let's remember, India was not ever a traditional society. India was traditional societies in the plural. The life of every person was a small life around here. You're talking, modern society, bounded by the nation state, is an altogether different issue. With regard to the question of the relationship between pluralism, religious pluralism, ritual and doctrinal toleration, or ritual or doctrinal intolerance, and, if you like, social tolerances and social harmony, is an extraordinarily complex and highly mediated one. What do I mean here? What I mean here is this thing, is that there is no decisive determination, unless you have this view about religion is decisive to understanding culture, culture is decisive to understanding society, and therefore the basis for developing order and so on. What you're really talking about is that when you take a supposedly intolerant doctrinal system, Islam, Christianity, etc., there is only one God, and therefore, of course, it's a jealous God, and therefore there is intolerance. But are we going to forget that because there is one God, there is also the equality of believers under one God, which stimulates its own mix, insofar as the relationship between religion and social tolerance, its own mix of tolerances and intolerances. The Indic faiths, there is supposed to be pluralism. Does pluralism mean tolerance? As Sudipta Kaviraj pointed out, plant life is plural. By that doesn't mean that it's, the registration of variety makes it tolerant. The very passive notion of that. But let us say that of course you don't have that, that you have these faiths which are doctrinally and ritually tolerant, and therefore they are much more conducive to the development of social harmony. But then even if you take that seriously, again this thing is so complicated, the very fact that you have a variety of gods and goddesses and ritual patterns and so on is one of the things that helps sustain one of the most profound systems of inequality anywhere in the world, the caste system. Because how on earth can you have a caste system if you're only going to have one God? Yeah, you have all kinds of problems, of course.